Okay, so we'll have a little bit of a change of tack from this morning's session. So this morning we learned a lot about buildings, infrastructure, and particularly talked about how to use energy more efficiently in the building infrastructure space. We could talk about energy for transport, and I know there's a lot of discussion, particularly in Dubai, about the shift to electric vehicles, and we can touch on that, and that will tie into the non-pollutant theme. But we could also talk about other areas as well. So I'll just run through a couple of topics just to get to whet your appetite and maybe have a think of some questions to ask the panel after we've had a bit of a discussion. So smart mobility, smart transport really encompasses a whole range of different things. I've mentioned energy, but we could also talk about smart pavement, smart asphalt that's got sensors embedded in it, self-monitoring, self-maintaining, self-healing. We could talk about connectivity on the road infrastructure, the rail infrastructure, which is starting to enable a whole lot of different products, services, and applications. And of course, ITS is in itself a smart technology, and there's more and more of that going into transportation systems in the region, especially in Dubai. One topic that comes up almost continuously in these events is autonomy, automated vehicles, self-driving vehicles, connected vehicles, again, really enabled by the smart technologies that are coming to market, and we can discuss how they will evolve in this region, and particularly in Dubai, where they've got a trial running, and that will extend. And we know that Dubai has a strategy for autonomous vehicles now, and we'll see many more of those on the roads, on the transport networks moving forward. And we could also talk about applications as well. So things like parking, things like public transport are all things that are enabled by smart infrastructure, smart technology. So as we get through the discussion, please have a think of questions for the panel. And really the theme of this panel is to talk about the opportunities in the UAE for some of these smart technologies. So perhaps, Anas, I'll start with you.
Okay.
And we were talking just outside about the needs for smart technology and how need should drive what's put in place. How do you see the need in the UAE and perhaps across the GCC for smart technologies?
Well, thank you, Akin. I think before we talk about technology and what can be used, it's very important that the technology is driven by the need that's defined by the end users. And the needs, for example, so before you bring technology is old. A lot of it exists out there and it's been used in many other areas. To bring that to mobility, you have to look at the need first. And for example, in Dubai, it's very specific. It's improving safety, improving congestion, the mobility as a service rather than just transportation. So when you talk about improving congestion, relieving congestion, there are several solutions that have been identified. And for example, and I'm throwing examples and for people to comment on, is to use reversible lanes on Sheikh Zayed Road to mitigate peak time, to get more out of the existing infrastructure without spending a lot more money. And this has a great benefit. And then the technology, so people who are developing the technologies should take that need and develop the technology that serves that need. So if you are talking about reversible lanes, where you change direction from morning peak to afternoon peak, you can identify several technologies that can serve you. It's variable messaging systems, letting the cars know this lane is okay, this lane is not okay. If you have ride-sharing cars in the future, autonomous vehicles, you can dedicate that lane to them. They can go at a constant speed and improve the traffic flow. So similarly for safety, because of a lot of the data is now being collected by SAD about the accidents, if you can identify, and that TRL does a lot of that accident analysis, you can identify the need from accident analysis and develop solutions from this data that serve that need. For example, if there are areas where accidents are more frequent, you can restrict the speed, and if the cars have speed control on them that is electronic, and you know accidents are more frequent at particular time, you can actually manage the speed. So that's what I talk about the need is think of the need first rather than technology first.
Okay, that's a good point. And just on the reversible lanes, I lived in Melbourne for several years, and Melbourne has a number of reversible lanes on their roads. And when I first started driving on them, it scared the life out of me because it's not separated traffic.
But see, this is a good point. If you know you have a technology that prevents other cars from getting into your lane, you'll drive comfortable. And it can be an automated cars, so nobody can get out of that lane. You can dedicate it.
Andy, we've talked about need. Obviously, you're coming from Hyperloop. What need does that address? And Hyperloop is obviously a very new and upcoming technology. How do you see that fitting into the UAE and solving some of the UAE's transportation problems?
I think there's definitely a need as we see it, and as we work with the RTA and with the government to address a lot of their concerns and a lot of the goals and the visions that the government wants to achieve. And we very much see it as an enabling technology to help the government get to where they want to be. And a couple of things that I definitely see a need where we address it is accident reduction. It is a fully enclosed, safe system. Congestion reduction, energy efficient, be all electric, passive maglev technology, so it's very efficient compared to alternative technologies like high-speed rail or something like that. And then just from a pure passenger demand standpoint, regionally there isn't too much rail here. There's a metro system in Dubai. Saudi has some rail, but outside of that, there isn't a lot of rail. I know there are a lot of plans on a drawing board. We see we can be complementary to those at certain distances and help really increase regional connectivity to move people and goods more efficiently and quicker and really unlock some GDP growth that way. So I think there's a lot of needs, the social benefits, and then also just the pure economic benefits that we can bring to the table.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to a discussion of economics in just a second. But before we do that, Nabil, we were talking about some of the applications that are enabled by smart technologies, and I know that CH2M is doing some work in that space.
Basically, going back a little bit back in history, I've been here for about 15, 16 years. I've seen a huge change in the approach that the authorities have had, and the nature of the RFPs, the nature of the work, the competition in the market, the level of growth in the cities, in the GCC generally, and the focus that the authorities have had into using technologies, going that way, is becoming more and more competitive. The technology is becoming more and more advanced. The applications that were not there a couple of years ago now are easily available, used by everybody. It's a huge opportunity to get people to use that technology, and how can it optimize the systems, the transportation, the mobility of people, the parking. One of the things we're advocating is the principles of shared smart parking. We've done some research on that recently. We presented it in one of the conferences in Qatar recently for MOTC. And the idea is to optimize parking structures using that technology and using a shared parking structure for different users, rather than every user having their own demands piling up to, say, a number. We could actually optimize that by about 30% by using the principles of shared smart parking. So things are heading that way, whether it's through the apps that take you from A to B, and the opportunities that come out of that. For example, reducing parking on service roads, having direct access into a main big structure rather than multi-structures, helping in terms of having less parking per building with another bigger parking for shared parking. And in future, when parking demands go down, that multi-story car park can be removed and changed in use. So there's a huge opportunity. It's very exciting, very interesting, the technology coming up. We see that change happening year upon year, and we're trying to catch up on that as consultants. Very interesting time, I think we're in, and there's lots to benefit from.
Can I ask a question to make live and make sure everybody's awake? I'm going to ask the audience a question. Who's here from the government? Client represents clients that appoints consultants. Can you raise your hand, please? Oh, good. That's good. So when you appoint consultants, and I'm speaking on behalf of the consultants, do you think the procurement strategy, the policies allow for innovation, allow the consultants to have adequate time to introduce such technologies? Or do you think we have to procure these things slightly differently?
I am from RTA, and yes, we do. And we are now using our research and development initiatives to make this happen more and more frequently, especially with the coming projects. So yes, procurement conditions and policies need to be amended, but it depends on how the leadership is willing to do that. And it is the main push which can make things happen. Other than that, with the old way we used to do things, there was no room at all for this kind of implementation and innovation.
That's right. And I'm happy to hear that because I think that's quite important. I think someone else was.
Hello. I work for a developer. We're one of the government developers. I think our challenge at the moment is obviously when we design our buildings, I think we have to meet the RTA standards as regards to parking. So obviously there is no provision for shared parking. And, you know, so we end up, our fear at the moment is we're going to end up building far too much parking provision than we ultimately need because of autonomous vehicles, because of all the changes that are coming. But until the government kind of really looks at the things as shared parking, and I think even on the infrastructure side, it was said in one of the earlier sessions that, you know, we all have to work to the guidelines that are given by the various authorities.
Yeah.
And so we're over-provisioning things, and that's a big concern to us. You know, we're at the moment just completing a traffic impact study for JLT, and one of our challenges there, we're using the RTA standards and the trip generations that come out of that, which means we end up effectively over-designing what might be needed in the future. So that's our biggest concern at the moment.
I think that leads to my second point that I was going to talk about, that if you're driven by need, you have to change your policies. Once you identify the need and the applicable technology, change your policy and the way you procure consulting and engineering that will implement those technologies, then you can get a successful implementation of that technology, and there will be good value for the investment.
I think it's a really good question, and if we take it a stage further, and if we look particularly at Dubai, that is clearly shifting from a city that has been a fast follower for new technology for many years. It's been very quick to implement new technologies, but hasn't traditionally played a leadership role. I think over the last couple of years, we've seen that shift where Dubai actually wants to be playing a global leadership role in implementing new technologies, which I think it's a great aspiration, but it comes with some risk. It comes with the risk of implementing technologies that have not been proven and that may fail. And how would you advise, you know, the UAE in its drive to both play a leading role in technology, transport technology, but also try and minimize that risk?
Can I add to that? I mean, just quickly, because the RTA did speak on that. I mean, RTA is very, very keen to look at new ideas, out-of-the-box thinking, step change. And no step change ideas can happen without major changes, whether it's to the policies, whether it's the nature of it and applicability within the region. I mean, there is a design competition happening at the moment for Sheikh Zayed Road, where 9 consultants are bringing the best of the best ideas. It's an initiative by His Excellency Matar Attire. So those ideas are going to be with RTA. And to take them forward, it's going to need a lot of changes in policies and adopting it. Yes, there are standards that have to be followed. Sometimes developers would like to build less parking, for example, just to save cost. But the idea is they're definitely going to look at public transport, other modes of transport, then fine. But if it's only to save costs, that's the worry. And that's why it has to be really fine-tuned and fitted well within the whole process that RTA has. But the initiative is definitely there. We've seen it in MOTC in Qatar, in RTA and DOT, or DMAT in Abu Dhabi as well, many of the authorities.
To answer your question on risk, everything has risk and it can be managed and mitigated. I'm sure every technology can be used as a pilot somewhere, and that's the credit to Dubai. They're willing to try these technologies in certain places, but is the Hyperloop safe?
I think I'm living the answer to your question every day. I would totally second the points on RTA. They've been incredibly innovative in the way they approach not just the procurement process, but in everything we do with them.
Yep.
Obviously, Hyperloop, we're in the process of building it. We're going to do our first test in the next couple of weeks. So there is no safety case that exists. And one example where RTA has been incredibly helpful and forward-thinking is how do we build a safety case? And that first safety case, if Dubai is the first route, would be based out of Dubai, and it would become a global standard for something that can be exportable. And so we're working with them on rail standards, aerospace standards, all sorts of different things. But the way you mitigate that risk is you put in place risk mitigation strategies. And what we've done is, rather than have a standard like vendor OE relationship, we very much sought to have a partnership with them and to work through what the risks are, highlight them up front, and come up with strategies to address each one. We're not going to be 100% of the way knowing everything that could happen, but as close as we can get, and then we make the best decisions on the path forward with the knowledge we have. And as we continue to test, as we continue to work with them, and we continue to learn, we come down that risk curve quite a bit. And that's been our day-to-day process in working through that. And as part of what we want to do also is invest in Dubai and make Dubai really the center of the next generation of transportation systems, whether it's building that safety case, whether it's doing a prototype route, whatever it may be. But that's where we really want to focus the efforts here. And we've opened up an office. We've had a team in place full-time since September, working towards that goal with the RTA.
I'm glad you mentioned the word invest, and perhaps this brings us back to the economic question. You know, for many of these new technologies, the commercial case for them isn't always apparent, especially if you're the first. So for something like the Hyperloop, if I think about what's involved in taking something from a piece of paper to actually moving people between Abu Dhabi and Dubai in 12 minutes, I think that the cost for that must be huge. You said, you know, demand isn't obvious, again, or the volume of demand isn't obvious. You know, how do you overcome the kind of economic uncertainties of bringing a new technology like this to market?
Well, a part of our innovation isn't just on the hardware and the components and the software. Part of it is actually how we're going to build and how we're going to research and develop things. And our DNA is very much out of SpaceX, which was a should-cost model. So the way we approach development in general, we think gives us a lot of opportunity for cost out. We're starting from the ground up too, so we don't have a lot of fat. So there's not a lot of layers and things that can slow us down. So what we end up having is actually a fairly good cost case that doesn't have a lot of overhead and waste in there. And then as we continue to come down the technology learning curve, we can continue to get cost out. So a sample route of Dubai to Abu Dhabi, I see it as being extremely cost competitive to alternative, like high-speed rail, whatever it may be. So I think we're in a good position there. Regionally, the demand is there. We have to make the safety case work, and we have to educate everybody on the benefits of using the system. We also have to make it convenient. We have to be fully integrated and fully complementary to existing modes of transportation. Just because you have a high-speed backbone, you still have first mile, last mile issues, and we have to figure out ways to integrate with that and the bus networks and all the other investments in the region. But the demand is certainly there, and I think on a cost basis, we're very attractive.
Okay, all right. All right, just changing tack slightly before we open up for questions on the floor. And part of the topic of this panel is around non-polluting, or I guess environmentally friendly technology, or the use of technology to enable that. How do you see that being implemented in the UAE, for example? Neil?
Well, there are. I mean, the trend currently is using cars still, and there has to be, as I said, step change in people going and moving into public transport, and to go to public transport and use public transport. I mean, maybe the transport by car is too low cost, maybe at the moment. If you look in Europe and other places, the cost of driving a car is very, very high. Not necessarily owning the car, but actually driving the car. Whether it's the fuel prices, the policies, the parking. I mean, in London, you pay about £4 an hour sometimes for parking, which is about 20 dirhams an hour. Currently, it's 2 dirhams an hour, so it's quite low. The tolls on Salik are quite low. So in terms of competition between public transport and cars, it does remain that public transport is not, it's not the choice at the moment. But there has to be a step change somehow. Connectivity, the first and last mile, people thinking about their journey in advance and taking it as a, it's a step change. But and I know that the RTA is looking for solutions for that. They want to definitely improve that, whether it's by having more tolls on the roads, whether it's looking at different solutions to.
I mean, I'm obviously the road tolls generate an awful lot of revenue for the RTA.
Absolutely.
I think what you're suggesting is perhaps increasing different forms of taxation to move people towards more environmentally friendly modes of transport.
Yeah.
Do you think that will go down well here?
Well, it has to hit the pocket somehow for people to make that change
Yeah,
sometimes.
I think it will go down well if you have an alternative to private cars. If you have a decent public transport that's accessible, that is linked, where you actually, and I think that's where data and technology could help in making public transport more accessible by providing more information about availability, ride sharing. So you can have different types of public transport, minibuses that are not just taxis.
Absolutely.
Then you'll see people moving to public transport by choice, not because you tax them. Please don't say that again.
Okay, good. All right.
You see, with more growth and more congestion,
by default, people
by
go
default
to
things will happen. I mean, sometimes congestion is seen as a sign.
So it's
of
an
prosperity.
investment into public transport rather than making the roads wider and bigger.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, I mean, I think we've already seen that with the metro as well, haven't we? Here, where when the metro is being built, I think there was a school of thought that said it'll never get used, and now it's full to capacity.
Yeah.
So there is an example for build it and they'll come. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other sort of uses of technology to improve sustainable transport?
I think it's countless when you think of the opportunities. It's really countless, but all of it will be centered around mobility as a service, not just transportation. It's making sure that everybody is connected, the optimum use of the infrastructure, including parking, and that's where technology providers need to focus on, is to identify those opportunities.
I mean, I was talking to the head of our infrastructure business in the UK yesterday, and he used to work at Transport for London. And we were talking about building smarter, more connected, more intelligent infrastructure, roads in particular. And his view was it's incredibly difficult to do in mature transport systems because you have to retrofit that, and it's very expensive and very disruptive. He said his feeling is there's an enormous opportunity here, especially where you're building lots of new roads. I mean, Qatar in particular is building a huge number of new roads. And his view is actually if you're building new roads, it's not that much more expensive to build these technologies in, even if you're not going to use them for a number of years until the applications catch up. Do you think that's a viable approach to building smart infrastructure here? Build it before it's needed?
Yeah, from the start, and that's why I talk about when you procure consulting services for design, you've got to allow more time for that type of innovation to be incorporated into the design and not rush into building the infrastructure to meet deadlines that are hard. Otherwise, you won't be able to implement it.
Absolutely. I mean, having it embedded in the designs and the construction at this stage, even though it's not needed, would save a huge amount of sums rather than retrofitting systems on, whether it's the ducts, allowing those or spare capacity for such systems to be introduced onto the road network. Definitely be a huge, minimum cost at this stage, but later on be very, very expensive to retrofit.
Yeah. I guess, Andy, the Hyperloop it's all new anyway. So.
but we see that problem all the time, like when we're talking to governments in US or in Europe, for example, or like brownfield retrofitting transportation in areas like Amsterdam or London or Los Angeles is incredibly expensive, very difficult to do. When you have greenfield opportunities, it just makes things a lot easier. And you can be smart about the way you build capacity. You don't have to build the 100% from day one. You can wait to see how it does fill and then start to kind of grow into it. It's sort of what is going on here with the new airport. It's not going to be 250 million passengers day one. They'll scale into that over time as the demand warrants it. But there's ways you can do it that I think would generate good returns.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left, so perhaps now's a good time to throw the microphone open to the floor. Yes, Gavin.
Hey guys, I just wanted to go back to your comment about answering the need, and Aiken touched upon it when you said that using the bi-metro as an example, where you thought many people thought it wasn't going to be used as much as it is now. I wanted to see if you could expand that to the rest of the GCC, looking at stuff like the Riyadh Metro and the challenges associated with that. How do you think that these new systems and implementing these new transport systems and new transport solutions, is that going to be a considerable challenge, and how are you going to address that challenge?
Okay, so I think the question is, new transport systems are going in across the GCC. We're looking at metros in Saudi, looking at metros in Qatar, potentially eventually metros in Kuwait. How do you see that working, and what are the challenges of doing that?
Only a couple of days ago, I said we were involved in the Riyadh Metro. Actually, we did the BRT design, full design, and it's looking at the three tiers, three elements. It's looking at the commuter buses, as well as the BRT system, as well as the metro. And not only one line, it's a whole system. So it's an all or nothing. I mean, before that, there wasn't any regulated buses in the city. So the culture of using public transport is not there. Now you're having a full metro system with a BRT and the buses, feeder buses to all the areas in Riyadh. There's going to be a huge impact. And talking to friends of mine in Riyadh and their approach to that, they're tolerating all the construction works happening in the city. They're closing some of the most important roads in Riyadh into one-way systems, etc. So it's a huge impact. The people are learning that, okay, it's worth waiting for a new system will be in the city. And there are cultural issues in Saudi or in Riyadh. I mean, the dependence on drivers for women, because women don't drive. So it's going to open, it's going to be a big step change, I'd say. So, and it's a complete system. But it does take time to build, and they're doing it.
But I think it's an opportunity rather than a challenge. I think the challenge will be if these things are not implemented, cities will stop to function well. Very near future. So,
any challenges from the Hyperloop, or introducing the Hyperloop to these types of countries?
I think our biggest challenge is just going to be education and public perception around things like the safety case. What's it going to feel like? What's the speed going to feel like? Is it safe? So our challenge is going to be much more around that public education aspect, and it's something we're trying to do proactively. But that's our.
Of course, if you've driven in the desert here, you'll know there's a high appetite for risk. So
exactly.
I don't think that'll be a challenge. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned very interesting things about building your infrastructure for the future, and basically building some technology within the infrastructure, let's say roads, to cater for the future development. But the question is, considering this part of the world when everything is on lump sum, who's going to pay for it, who's going to maintain it, and how are you going to guarantee that in 10 years this technology is not become obsolete?
Okay. Good question.
I mean, sometimes it's in terms of soft planning. Sometimes you want to keep a little bit of a right-of-way, for example. Let's call it a smart right-of-way within a right-of-way for a road. So leaving something, it doesn't have to be necessarily something that you have, but even in designing that, sometimes you can make them a little bit wider or whatever. It might be something that you offer the client later on, and they can add it as a variation, for example, within your scope, because something that they'll benefit from later on. And I'm sure that the authorities would welcome something like that with their initiative, and it could be an alternative offer that you give them, because you're investing into the future. I know, yes, it is a very competitive market, so you want to be as competitive as possible, but that's something that I'm sure authorities might consider as an alternative.
And I'd like to add to that. I think technology would need less infrastructure rather than more. When we talk about using technology to optimize the use of existing infrastructure, I think that is the theme moving forward in the future. To use more capacity of existing parking, you need less parking. So who's going to pay for it? Actually, the question is somebody's going to save money, right? And I think because it's all about data and data management, it's not about driving fast technology for faster cars or bigger cars. It's about maximizing the use of the current infrastructure. And I think the cost, the value that you get out of this is tremendous when you compare to the benefits. It's a good question.
If I can also add to that, I think one of the shifts that I've seen even over the last sort of 5 years is a much greater appreciation of the value of an asset once it's been built. And in fact, the whole life cost of an asset is starting to play a much bigger role in the decision making around what you build, how you maintain it. So I think there's also a communication piece. Well, before there's communication, there's a thinking piece that needs to be done around, okay, it's going to cost a bit more now, but actually what could that potentially save you in the future? And I think if those sorts of arguments are clearly articulated, then we can start to address some of the questions around lowest cost, smallest price, because it becomes part of a bigger discussion. And I think the time is ripe for more of those discussions now. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Building it. And it's very well established when you design your railway system, you have to design for future upgrading. But it's not in the road or any other infrastructure project. And therefore, you need to educate the clients what's in it for them to have the system flexible to be upgraded in the future. And you have to talk to the accountant as well. You're going to pay more now, but the next accountant is going to benefit out of it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. All right, any other questions? I think we've probably got time for one, possibly two more questions before we wrap up. Yes, gentlemen on the side here.
Hi, I'm Neil McCulloch from WSP Parsons Brinkhoff. It's more of a comment rather than a question. I think in terms of the applications and the technologies there, a lot of it exists already. The first thing, well, my wife and I look at when we're going somewhere is probably Google Earth. We can see straight from Google Earth if there's congestion on a particular road which we're going on. It means we can take an alternative route. So there's a lot of technology already in existence today, which is at our fingertips. You know, the same thing could be probably extended to like car parking as well, which if it's not already done or thought about. So there's a lot of stuff which is there already in the mainstream.
Okay. I think it's a very good comment. I mean, to the panel, what's out there today that we could be using more of?
I think what's interesting, and refer back to the conference we attended recently, it was more a technology one. So it was all technology providers. They had all the tools possible. But what we felt it was lacking the consultancy arm that can work with the technology provider to come up with something that's really optimal and usable. Technology is there, but how do you adopt it as a transport planning or a consultant to make sure, because we see the problems from the eyes of constantly in transport. The technology is there to provide, but getting the two together, I think that's the right way. Yes, Google Earth is there. There are apps available. The principles we are talking about is the shared smart parking. So it's not the parking apps, how to get the two together. And we have a demo actually here on an app. We can show some examples if you wish. But that's the idea, getting the consultants to work with technology.
Anas?
No, I totally agree, and that I hate to repeat myself. Once you identify the need, you develop the policy, you procure the consultancy service that allows you to implement those innovative solutions, then you go through implementation rather than going through the opposite track.
I think that's good. I'd like to perhaps add one further comment to that, which is it's an example that I've used several times, so apologies if any of you have heard it before, but about a year ago I was having a conversation with a gentleman from the city of Glasgow in the UK who was driving their smart city agenda. And they had a small pot of money to use from the UK government to generate smart initiatives. And he said they spent a very, very small amount of it just opening up Glasgow's data. And he said they actually had far more innovation for free for application developers who pounced on that data, developed new applications, many of them transport related. And so they came up with ideas that we couldn't have thought of, and they did it for free. And the things that we did, that we funded, were good, but were limited. So I think if we're talking about what's already there, and again, we touched on it this morning, there's an awful lot of data that's sitting in places across many of our cities, not just here, but across the world. And if we can tap into that, I know there are some security question marks, etc., but if we can tap into that, I think there's a lot of things we can do for actually not very much cost. Maybe time for one more question before we wrap up. If not, we're on time. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank our panel very much. We've got Nabil Khan, Anas Kasim, and Andy Norrigan. Thank you very much indeed for a fascinating conversation. So
Thank you.
Thank you.